Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Morning, afternoon.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Hi, it's 1 o'clock, but I think we need to wait for some more minutes. Because not everyone is online yet. Hello, Rosita.
Hi, Alessandra. How are you?
I'm good, you?
Yeah, we miss only
Quiet.
Professor Burke. We miss only Professor Burke, but if he doesn't
Yeah,
come,
exactly.
I would suggest to start in 5 minutes anyway, because John has to go at some stage. So in 5 minutes
Okay.
we will start, and if Professor Burke arrives, we will include him when he arrives. I just sent a mail to him, but
Okay. Yeah.
I have 3 hours, so that's not important that we go right on time.
no, but it should not be 3 hours anyway.
That's what I'm saying. I have more time than it will take, even if he's late.
It disappeared.
No, no, Rosita, you are still there.
Yeah, but my computer now it started to do strange things. Okay, now I see you again.
The problem is we miss Professor Burke, but I would say at 1:05 we'll start, and then if Professor Burke comes, I don't know which problems he may have, we will give him the floor when he comes.
Voila. Professor Burke is here.
I don't see. Oh, hi.
Hello, everyone.
Perfect.
We can
Hello, good
start
afternoon.
and use the regular schedule.
Okay, perfect. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the webinar Chairman Lee, Shincheonji, and the COVID-19, reflecting on the verdict of the Suwon District Court organized by CESNER that I'm very glad to introduce today. Those of you who are familiar with the Shincheonji case will be aware of the background of this matter, and those of you who are not familiar with it will have some clear understanding of that today. Further detailed information and in-depth study on the Shincheonji case, such as scholarly articles and several white papers, are available on the CESNER websites as well as on Human Rights Without Frontiers and Freedom of Belief websites. Past seminars recordings are available too. Over the last 12 months, Shincheonji was severely challenged by the South Korean authorities, and the January 13 verdict absolving Shincheonji's leader, Chairman Lee, from charges of obstructing the anti-pandemic efforts has very important international implications. Also because the decision has clarified that Shincheonji promptly and actively cooperated with health authorities when requested, contrary to what propagated via a disgraceful and outrageous media campaign all over the world. Today, we have a panel composed of experienced international speakers. Sharon Burke, Professor of Law at Friedrich Schiller Universität, with a focused interest in international studies and with vast international experience. John Grisafi, specialist in Korean studies, researching in religious studies and Asian religions at Yale University. Massimo Introvigni, sociologist of religion, founder and director of CESNER, the Center for Studies on New Religions, and Bitter Winter. Willy Fautré, human rights advocate, founder and director of Human Rights Without Frontiers. Rosita Shorite, long-term United Nations diplomat for Lithuania and founder and director of ORLIR, International Observatory of Religious Liberty of Refugees. Every speaker will have between 10 to 15 minutes for their presentations. If time allows, as I guess and hope, questions and answers will be at the end of the webinar. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Sharon Burke, who will focus on the main legal issues about the Infectious Diseases Control and Prevention Acts and human rights. Please, Sharon, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you first of all, Alessandro, for that introduction. I will keep my comments very general in this regard because I think it's important not to speak in legalese and rather to speak in general terms about the persecution of Chairman Lee and the underlying issues. Obviously, generally, the responses to COVID-19 around the world have varied greatly from state to state. This is a pandemic for which states were clearly unprepared, and yet we have seen in the media that Korea in general has been marked out as one of the states that has done better than most. The number of overall infections has been suppressed, and generally there has been quite broadly positive press coverage. This was partly due to having had some experience with similar outbreaks in the past, namely SARS and MERS, both of which hit Korea pretty hard in the past. And this resulted in the bringing into force by the then Korean government of the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act, the IDCPA of 2015. And essentially this piece of legislation, as we've already discussed in past sessions, has a lot of problematic aspects. It gives the government very broad powers to deal with an emergency, which is commendable to some extent, but there are problems with it because it it avoids classing an emergency as an emergency, if you like. Generally speaking, international human rights law provides for far-reaching protections for individuals against discrimination and against treatment on the basis of affiliation to particular groups or affiliation to particular religions. There is a certain amount of scope for such protections to be, I won't say removed, but lightened on the basis of emergency provisions in international human rights treaties. However, this can only really happen on a case-by-case basis. The problem with the IDCPA is that it concretizes many of the measures that can be taken by the Korean government on the basis of ordinary legislation. So it says this is a toolbox that we can use whenever we have another pandemic. Now, obviously, the COVID-19 provided an opportunity to use this legislation, and it seems to have been used in a somewhat uneven, somewhat piecemeal manner. In particular, the Shincheonji Church, while it has been factually connected with a good number of cases of COVID-19, has been targeted in a manner that is, or that would seem to be quite disproportionate. So this legislation, which, as I say, provides a toolbox, a suite of powers, if you like, that that the government can use, has to some extent aided the government in meeting the challenges that have resulted from COVID-19. But equally, because the legislation is basically styled in the form of a toolbox, it has allowed the government in power at the time to choose when and how to employ these tools. And what we've seen is that the tools contained in the legislation have been employed in a very forceful manner against the Shincheonji Church of Jesus, and not against other groups that have also been at the center of COVID-19 clusters. And what we have seen is that the Shincheonji Church has been subjected to targeted measures, including property searches, including unwarranted incursions into their sphere, including the surrender of information that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the clusters and the outbreaks, including requests for the names of all of their members, including members abroad who couldn't factually be linked to the outbreak, et cetera, whereas other groups haven't been asked to surrender similar information, despite the fact that they were linked to such clusters. So essentially, when we talk about this toolbox, we see it as a potentially a very effective means of dealing with the pandemic that has to some extent been abusively employed. And this abusive employment, this uneven employment, if you like, is a direct contravention of principles of non-discrimination and proportionality that underlie the relevant human rights norms that are at issue here. So generally speaking, when we talk about Korea, we talk about a country that has a relatively good human rights record, and the legislation in question, on the face of it, is a justifiable means of dealing with the challenge of a pandemic. It is rather the way in which this legislation has been employed that is particularly problematic. And obviously, we've seen the press release of the 13th of January from the Suwon District Court that resulted in the Suwon District Court issuing a relatively surprising verdict in the light of this legislation. And it's good to focus on elements of this. I mean, I've only received a translation. I don't speak Korean, so I apologize if my understanding of this is somewhat inaccurate, and I'm sure I'll be corrected if it is. But from what I can see here, essentially Chairman Lee, while he was charged with violation of the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act and various other charges, including obstruction of performance of official duties, many of which fell under this act, he was acquitted of these charges. Now, this is quite singular if you have any knowledge of Korean law, simply because the conviction rate in criminal trials is above 97%. So what's interesting is that although Korea, like many Southeast Asian countries, or East Asian countries rather, has transplanted elements of a westernized legal system into their domestic law. So on the face of it, their legal codes are quite similar to what we might have in Europe or in the United States. The conviction rate in criminal trials is extremely high. We saw this issue come up in relation to Japan, in relation to the escape of Carlos Ghosn from Japan some time ago. What he said basically is, I've been charged with the crime. I am therefore, according to Japanese law, effectively guilty, because the conviction rate in Japan is over 99%. And we see that although the law on the face of it is very similar, the conviction rates are so high as to make it effectively the prosecutor who decides whether you're guilty rather than the judge in many cases. So any sort of acquittal is quite singular, quite remarkable in the context of a Korean case. Now, Chairman Lee has been found guilty of other offenses. We will probably get into those in the discussion, but with regard to the offenses that he's been acquitted of, what I can see from the from the judgment of the court is, or from the press release linked to the judgment of the court, which is what I have I have access to, is that effectively the court has more or less agreed with the analysis that the way in which this act has been employed is contrary to international human rights obligations incumbent upon the Republic of Korea. So rather than factually finding that Chairman Lee is factually innocent, if you like, the court's judgment seems to revolve around the fact that the government has engaged in an excès de pouvoir in this regard. And that's good and that's bad. It's good, of course, from the perspective that it shows that the public institutions, the courts of the Republic of Korea, are prepared to uphold the rule of law. They're prepared to uphold Korea's international human rights obligations and hold other government organs or organs of the public administration to account when they exceed invocation of legislation that is undertaken in a manner that is, if you like, incompatible with international human rights law. However, it's bad because ultimately it doesn't factually clear Chairman Lee of having done done wrong, if you like. It's not being cleared on the facts. It's still allowing for, if you like, a government to come after a religious leader in this manner. So overall, getting to the right, if you like, getting to the right result, but still some reservations about how that was done. I think it's a hopeful verdict, however, because I think ultimately what's likely to happen from this, and I've spoken to one or two contacts in Korea, is that there is already talk about this piece of legislation being amended to restrain the power of the government in this regard in the future. And even if it isn't, this court judgment shows that successful prosecutions of individuals under this legislation will not be possible for the government if they do not do so in a manner that is compatible with international human rights law. Now, the next question that we might go on to is a question of redress and what this means for the Shincheonji Church of Jesus, because obviously a lot of things have been published about them in the last number of years, last number of months, that could be potentially defamatory. Obviously, their reputation has been damaged, and what redress Korean law can allow for that, and what redress international law allows for that. But I'm sure these are points that we're going to come on to in the discussion. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have John. John Grisafi will be sharing with us notes on COVID-19, the media campaign, and the court verdict. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Chair Burke, for setting up some of the legal understanding of this really well. And I very much agree with the way you summarized the significance of that verdict and how they ruled on it. And I'll get to that toward the end of my talking points. So I'll just go over what happened with Shincheonji in South Korea with relation to COVID, and how this was discussed in the media, the public discourse, and how that discourse influenced the government. As pretty much, I think everyone already knows, back in February of last year, so we're almost a year out from this now, it's amazing. South Korea experienced a sudden jump in their infection rate of COVID-19, and in fact, it doubled overnight on February 21st. And within 2 weeks, it had increased about 16-fold from a little over 400 to more than 7,000. And this spike was associated with a cluster infection in the city of Daegu in the southeast of South Korea, where a woman who was known as patient 31, because of anonymizing of patients, meaning she was the 31st confirmed COVID patient in South Korea, not the first, as some people believe. She was a member of the Shincheonji Church of Jesus, and she was identified as a so-called super spreader. And because of that, the largest infection cluster that occurred in Daegu really hit hard in the Shincheonji congregation in that city. But Shincheonji was already known and quite controversial before the COVID pandemic for many years. And this controversy, in my opinion, had a significant influence on the public response to that religious association with the virus. And these pre-existing negative attitudes toward the group, the type of language used in the media and the public to describe it, this really shaped the way that people responded and way the government responded to this cluster infection toward Shincheonji and the pandemic for the remaining year. Formerly known as the Shincheonji Church of Jesus, Temple of the Tabernacle of the Testimony, very long name, which was just called Shincheonji. It was founded in South Korea in 1984 by Imam Hee, and it's a Christian-derived new religious movement that was influenced heavily by two other Christian movements that he had been affiliated with earlier. And it's just one of many so-called new religions in South Korea today that has its roots in Christianity. Because like most of these new religious movements, it deviates in some way, I don't want to say deviate, but breaks or differs in some way from its related established tradition in its theology and its liturgy. That causes the more mainstream tradition, in this case especially Protestant Christianity, to regard that religious group as a heresy. Again, this is a matter of opinion, but the established larger traditions have a strong influence on what's considered heresy or not. But what has made Shincheonji a little bit more controversial has been their reputation as competing strongly with mainstream Protestant churches who are quite influential in society and politics for membership. And while the nature and extent of their methods have been exaggerated somewhat, it is true that they do have traditionally targeted their conversion efforts at members, often new members or disaffected members of other Christian, usually Protestant churches. And sometimes they engage in the practice of sending their members into those churches to make contacts. It's these practices that have made other Christians in Korea wary of Shincheonji and its motives. And this fueled a lot of widespread attitude and speculation and suspicion about the religion. Now, that resulting social stigma, along with organized efforts to pressure Shincheonji members into converting back to Protestantism, this leads a lot of members of Shincheonji to be quite secretive about their ties to the religion. Now, that combined together to fuel particularly charged speculation about Shincheonji's behavior in regards to COVID. People became fearful that infected Shincheonji members who were concealing their identity would expose people to the virus unknowingly, known to the others. They would know they had the virus. And there was even allegations, which were not proven, that Shincheonji was intentionally going to spread the virus to other churches. And there was no good evidence of this. This was conspiracy theory type stuff. Now, the media coverage and the general public discourse on Shincheonji was really colored by these pre-existing views. Example is some of the terminology that came up in the media, the formal media as well as social media, and people talking about this were terms in Korean such as Idan Jongyo, which is heretical religion, or Saibi Jongyo, pseudo or false religion. And these terms are roughly analogous in their effect to the words cult or sect in English. It conveys the idea that it's not really a real religion. The South Korean interdenominational Christian newspaper, Christian Today, not the same as Christianity Today, different. They actually called the group an Idan Saibi Jipdan, a heretical pseudo group. They wouldn't even use the word religion when describing it. And even a lot of the more mainstream media that shied away from words like cult and pseudo religion still very frequently use adjectives such as secretive, fringe, and shadowy. And this kind of terminology, whether the nouns or the adjectives, when it's used to describe an already marginal religion, it popularizes even further the impression that the group's somehow not legitimate, that it's problematic, that it contravenes the rules of a secular society. And these views and this rhetoric kind of influenced the government's approach. The public health agencies in South Korea implemented measures, as we've already heard, to contain the virus through contact tracing and testing. But as Charenberg alluded to, rather than focus specifically in this initial cluster on tracing the contacts of patient 31 or even of everyone in the Daegu congregation, they decided instead to just test all members of Shincheonji nationwide. And the tracking down of all members of a religious group by a government is something that I find unsettling in any context. But there's also some concrete problems that this created with regard to their containment efforts. It turned out that outside the Daegu congregation, that initial cluster, Shincheonji members' rate of infection was no higher than the rest of the population. And the health ministry even publicly said so, that there was no correlation between Shincheonji affiliation and COVID infection outside of the Daegu cluster. Now, of course, they couldn't have proven this without testing them all, but it kind of just showed that they maybe have wasted effort by doing so. But another problem was that non-Shincheonji members found problems with this. Because the government was so focused on tracking down the entire religion and testing them, other people found difficulties getting tested. At least one symptomatic woman is reported to have been denied testing and then later died of the virus because she didn't fit the two categories despite being symptomatic, either having been to China or being Shincheonji, which was the priority of early testing. And there's even reports of some non-members claiming that they were in Shincheonji so they could get tested for free and right away, abusing the system, so to speak. Another issue that this really generated a lot of the negative discourse further was the list controversy. The public health authorities ordered Shincheonji to turn over a list of their members and their addresses, along with property held by Shincheonji. Now, the early lists initially, some of the early lists initially omitted members in 3 categories that they were trying to protect. Children under the age of 18 who would live with their parents anyway. Overseas members who, I think Chairman has already pointed out, many of these people are not Korean citizens. They have never set foot in Korea. It's really questionable whether the Korean government should be getting their information. And prospective members, the so-called students, people who have not committed to joining the religion yet, and understandably might want to keep that information closely guarded. Now, this meant that the initial list, the numbers didn't match Shincheonji's publicly claimed number of global adherents, because religions, always go for the higher end when they talk about their numbers. But that understandably generated suspicion, though Shincheonji, when asked again by the authorities, did turn over more comprehensive lists later. Now, that discrepancy was interpreted differently by different parties. The public health authorities were really trying to encourage Shincheonji to cooperate, and they were trying to work with them as much as possible. And they concluded publicly that the discrepancies were most likely the result of honest miscommunication and errors. And they said this is probably not intentional or malicious. But the Justice Ministry, and as well as several elected politicians, wanted to take a harder line against not only the pandemic, but against the religion. And they publicly expressed the opinion that Shincheonji was deliberately concealing information and impeding containment of the virus, which connects with the charges that we'll be talking about. And now both of those perspectives, I think, are examples of how observers and power holders, when looking at what a marginal religious movement is doing, they interpret it based on their own views and in a way that justifies their own preferred courses of action. Closely connected with the religious controversy is the issue of raids. The public health officials warned that coercive measures could be counterproductive to containment efforts. Some of the politicians and law enforcement officials pressed ahead with them anyway. Governor Lee Jae-myung of South Korea's Gyeonggi province, where Shincheonji's headquarters is located, this is separate from the Daegu branch, this is just the branch congregation. He accompanied police on a raid of the headquarters facility, and he proudly described that to the media as reminiscent of 007. And he said it was necessary to obtain all member information, which again, public health authorities disputed that. Likewise, South Korea's Justice Minister, Chu Mie, publicly said that an all-out war against Shincheonji might be necessary. And she publicly signaled support for the raids, not just Lee's, but any other raids. And while she acknowledged to the public, to the media, that there was no legal precedent for such raids, she cited a public opinion poll on the matter as justification, which is really clear evidence that this negative popular discourse on the religion emboldened these kind of actions by the government, going beyond stuff that we've seen before, literally doing something that she said was unprecedented. Additionally, in July, some Shincheonji facilities in Gwacheon, a city in Gyeonggi province, were demolished because they suddenly turned up some code violations, and some decided that they needed to demolish the buildings entirely, which is quite reminiscent of some things that have happened historically with other new religious movements that governments took issue with. And at the end of that month, July 31st, authorities arrested Chairman of the Shincheonji, Lee Man-hee, on the charges of conspiring to withhold information and impeding the government's disease control efforts. Finally, just this past month, January 13th, the district court in Suwon acquitted Lee on these charges, and the judge ruled that the discrepancies on the member list controversy, she didn't say that they didn't happen, but as Chairman Berg alluded to, she said that they did not constitute an obstruction of epidemiological investigation. So there's kind of this line flying where not saying he didn't do it, but saying that this wasn't the crime that he was being charged with. Now, this judgment was, again, as I alluded to earlier, consistent with the way that the public health authorities interpreted the situation almost a year ago. But despite that, the conclusion reached by the health and welfare and by this judge, the charges, I think, facilitated the popular support for the arrest and indictment of Lee, who was convicted on charges unrelated to COVID. And my understanding is Massimo Antrivini will be talking about those charges next.
Thank you, John. We are perfectly following the time frame we gave to the seminar. Thank you for that. And now Massimo Introvigne of Cessna. Massimo will talk about the accusations of embezzlement of funds and holding illegal events. Massimo, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro. My starting point is something Professor Burke said. When this case started, almost everybody in Korea was sure Chairman Lee would be convicted because, as it was already said, the conviction rate in the Korean court is 97%, meaning that almost everything prosecutor said is accepted by the judges. However, there was one very astute observer of Korea writing in the Korea Times, and his name was Mike Breen, and he is a British author, an expatriate who has married a Korean wife and lived in Korea for several decades. And he wrote this article in the Korea Times saying that conviction was sure, but perhaps not for COVID-related offenses. And he was quite prophetic, and he was, as far as I know, the only article which appeared in Korean media accurately predicting the outcome. And Breen went on to say that in all cases against unpopular religious groups, embezzlement of funds is always thrown in as a sort of a parachute that in the unlikely event that the main charges fail, will nonetheless save the face of the prosecutors. In other words, Chairman Lee was, as we say in Italy, thrown into the first page of the media as a monster for the plague, alleged plague spreading activities as the spreader of the COVID-19 epidemic. That was what everybody was talking about. But then, just to make sure he will be convicted, they threw in these other charges as a backup plan. Now, why were these charges successful? And as we all said, it was already exceptional that he was found not guilty of obstructing the COVID prevention. But why was he found guilty of the other charges? If we look at the history of Korean new religions, we see that many, if not most, leaders had some experience of jail. And together with other accusations, such in cases not related with Shincheonji, for instance, sexual abuse, they were always convicted for embezzlement of funds in a way that resonated with the Korean public opinion and the stereotype of the new religion or false religion or cult, where there is a leader preying on gullible followers and milking them of their money. Now, that's just a stereotype. We scholars of new religious movements, we know that money scandals are not more prevalent in new religious movements than they are in older religions. Just in 2020, we had the big scandals of mismanagement of funds involving one of the most senior Vatican cardinals and the head of a large Buddhist order. These are traditional rather than new religions. However, there is a difference in the case of new religions where the founder is still alive, which may make it somewhat easier to convict the leader for embezzlement of funds. And this is that when a religion is young, when the founder is still alive, normally it's not so easy to distinguish the personal funds of the leader and the funds of the movement, or the bank accounts of the leader and the bank accounts of the movement. And those who donate gifts, they want to donate to the movement, but they also want to donate to the leader because the leader is the movement. Shincheonji is centered around the idea that Chairman Lee is the pastor promised in the book of Revelation to lead humanity into a better world. So supporting the travels, the activities, the way of living of Chairman Lee and supporting the mission of Shincheonji is one and the same. And Alessandro and Willie, we have discussed other cases like the gifts to the founder of Taiji Men movement in Taiwan. He also went to jail and then was found innocent, happily, of all charges, because there is always this way, if a new religious movement is unpopular, to go after the alleged embezzlement of funds. So let me now very quickly summarize the three issues for which Chairman Lee was found guilty of embezzlement of funds. The first issue deals with the fact that Shincheonji is organized into 12 tribes. And two tribes, the tribe of Matthias and the tribe of Peter, sent some money that prosecutors said was intended for Shincheonji, but it ended up in Chairman Lee's personal accounts. It supported his travels. That is somewhat controversial, but prosecutor also believed supported the purchase of a boat where guests who visited the headquarters were taken on the river and other expenses. That's accusation number one. Accusation number two is Chairman Lee is also the leader of a humanitarian organization and peace organization called HWPL, and he was accused of moving funds from the account of the HWPL to his personal account. And number three, and that's to me is the most fantastic accusation, he was accused because Shincheonji spent money to build something called the Peace Palace, and the prosecutor said the Peace Palace was the personal residence of Chairman Lee. Now, what about these three issues? The tribes of Peter and Matthias said they didn't feel they were victims. They had no quarrels that their money was used for travels and other activities by Chairman Lee, because Chairman Lee hardly has a private life. What he does to represent the movement. When he travels for the movement. When he receives people, he does for the movement. In the case of HWPL, people testified that they wanted to donate money to Chairman Lee. And at one stage, this money was, so to speak, parked on the account of HWPL, but the donors intended to donate to Chairman Lee. And as I said, I'm astonished by the accusation about the Peace Palace, because I've been to the Peace Palace twice, as did some others in this panel. And in the Peace Palace, there is a small apartment where Chairman Lee stays when he is there. But the biggest part of the Peace Palace that I have visited is a conference center. And there is also a museum on the history of Shincheonji and HWPL. Now, on the Peace Palace, the court did not adopt a criterion of size prevalence, because I don't know if somebody in the court went to the Peace Palace. If they did, they would have said that 90% or more, it's not living quarters for Chairman Lee. It's like going to the Vatican and say the Vatican is a personal property of the Pope because he has an apartment there. But they adopted a chronological criterion of prevalence, say, they do only 10 events per year there, while Chairman Lee lives there 10 days per month or more. But of course, an event you should prepare. In very few convention centers, you do events every day. And it is not only about the events. For instance, I have been received by Chairman Lee there, and that's not because I'm a personal friend of Chairman Lee. I'm not. I'm a scholar, and I was interested in interviewing him, and I interviewed him about Shincheonji, not about how much he enjoys the nearby river. So this is, of course, an activity receiving scholars and others wanting to talk with him. He does on behalf of Shincheonji. So building this palace was clearly to the benefit of Shincheonji. Now, to be on the safer side, when prosecutors started talking about embezzled funds, Chairman Lee went to his personal accounts and gave back the money to the two tribes, to HWPL. And that, the court said, was taken into account in giving him a suspended sentence and not sending him to jail again. But in general, this accusation And this disparate of the decision is based on a misunderstanding of how in a new religious movement the relations between the leader and the group operates. And there is also an important footnote that the court acknowledged that all the story of embezzlement of funds was mostly supported by one witness, because all the other witnesses say there is no embezzlement of funds. We are very happy that the money donated was used by Chairman Lee. And this is a woman called Kim Nam-hee. Miss Kim was sort of second in command of Shincheonji for several years. She believed to be the successor of Chairman Lee, the appointed successor, something Chairman Lee and the movement denied, which led to quarrels, to the expulsion of Miss Kim from Shincheonji. She tried to establish a splinter group. And Miss Kim was left the movement with money. She was sentenced for embezzlement of funds and found guilty with a final decision. So at the end of the day, to save the face of the prosecutors and convict Chairman Lee for something, the court had to believe a woman that Korean judges had sentenced with a final decision for having embezzled funds herself. And of course, she is extremely vindictive against Chairman Lee. She told stories the two of them were romantically involved, that the 89-year-old Chairman Lee denies. But that's just folklore. The long and the short is that judges should not easily believe so-called apostates who have left new religious movements, because they have their own agenda. And in this case, this particular apostate had been found guilty with a final decision of stealing money herself. So she was not a credible witness. Just one quick word. Chairman Lee was also accused of having organized illegal events. And that refers to all the stories well before the COVID, so COVID concerns were not involved. All this event, which took place, let me check, in 2014, 15, 17, 18, and 19, followed the same scheme. Shincheonji or HWPL, in most cases, rented premises, stadiums, for big events. These were HWPL events about peace, which were attended by former prime ministers and presidents of several countries, and where nobody talked about the theology of Shincheonji. These were cultural and political events. What happened is HWPL or some other organization signed an agreement with the mostly public owners of stadiums. Then the anti-Shincheonji, the anti-cult groups started taking to the street, threatening riots if the events will take place, and pressuring the authorities to cancel the contracts. And the contracts were canceled, but in the normally a few days, in some cases, few hours before the event. And so Chairman Lee and Shincheonji, who had already organized the event, sued the landlords, ignored the cancellation, and went on with the event anyway. So in their attempt to finding something against Chairman Lee when the COVID accusations were not working very well, the prosecutor decided to flog a dead horse and to resurrect these old cases. Now, all these old cases have been settled. In some cases, Shincheonji had paid extra money, and the cases were forgotten. And that more or less was accepted by the district court, because the district court said that in 4 out of 5 cases, the cases were already resolved between the parties and there was nothing new to say. But they found that in 1 out of 5 cases, the case referring to the year 2017, that they believe it was still not entirely resolved. Even in this case, Shincheonji had paid some money, and the landlords had said they were happy enough and found Chairman Lee had organized an illegal event. I don't know how much we waited in the jail, suspended jail penalty finally against Chairman Lee, but this is very unfortunate because in all these cases, Shincheonji was really the victim, not the perpetrator of a crime, because they had signed very regular contracts. And in South Korea, everybody knows that HWPL or volunteer association that existed in the past is connected with Shincheonji. If they would know, the Christian media, the anti-cult media would remember them every day. So what happened is that the landlords or the politicians got scared by the anti-cultists and canceled perfectly regular contracts. So Shincheonji here was the victim of discrimination rather than the perpetrator of any wrongdoing, yet it was paradoxically accused of illegality. Summing up and concluding, we should be very happy that the COVID accusations were liquidated by the court, although, as Professor Burke said, it's difficult that there will be a real restoration or damages for the immense damage done to the reputation of Shincheonji. And we should see the accusations of embezzlement of funds and holding illegal events as just a parachute built to save the face of the prosecutors, and as something often used against new religions and new religious movements in Korea. And when the international media cover the case and say, yes, he has been found not guilty for the COVID, but guilty of embezzlement of funds, that sounds very sinister. But when you study how new religious movements operate, you see that what happened with Chairman Lee and these funds was totally normal, and also that the sinister connotations were largely created by a woman who had been expelled from the movement and had been convicted herself with a final decision for stealing money from the movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. The next speaker is Willy Futre of Human Rights Without Frontiers. Willy will set the 13th of January verdict within the general framework of anti-cultism and of opposition to Shincheonji in Korea. Please, Willie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro, for giving me the floor for addressing this issue from another and additional perspective. Indeed, on the 13th of January of this year, the Suwon District Court acquitted Chairman Lee, the founder and leader of Shincheonji Church in South Korea, from charges that he had allegedly obstructed the anti-COVID-19 efforts by the health authorities. Chairman Lee was arrested during the night of the 31st of July and the 1st of August. Despite his age, he was then 89 years old, and his fragile health, he had 2 back surgeries in the recent years. His lawyers did not manage to get his release on bail, and he was kept in custody until the 12th of November. It's only after 104 days of pre-trial detention that he was finally granted bail for medical reasons. When he was acquitted, the judiciary, as it was said already before, tried to save its face by saying that he had been arrested on other charges as well. The media, which had stigmatized him and the movement, also attempted to save their faces by pointing at 2 other accusations: the alleged embezzlement of funds belonging to Shincheonji for building the Palace of Peace, and also, which is another, in fact, another legal entity of the church, and also of having maintained an event in 2019 that the authorities had asked to cancel because of a so-called typhoon alert. These ludicrous charges, which would not have justified over 100 days of detention of an 89-year-old man, finally declared innocent of the main charges referred to the COVID issue. In a white paper about the scapegoating of Shincheonji, published last year by Chesnur and HRWF, it was contended that Chairman Lee had not committed any criminal negligence in the management of the COVID crisis. And as we have now seen, this was confirmed by the recent ruling of the District Court of Suwon. After investigating the charges, the signatories of the white paper concluded that the other charges were also clearly instrumentalized by some vested interest groups, with the purpose to tarnish the reputation of Shincheonji and their leaders. And Massimo has just extensively diffused the additional unfounded charges. Now, who are these vested interest groups which stigmatized and demonized Chairman Lee, and why? For about 20 years at least, Shincheonji, a prosperous new religious movement, has been viewed by many Protestant churches as a troublemaker because its message and its theology have been attracted many young people, including university students and graduates. The estimated number of Shincheonji members varies between 240,000 and 300,000, but the overwhelming majority of them are coming from fundamentalist Protestant churches. In this intra-Christian competition, the first objective of these Protestant churches was, and still is, to negatively portray Shincheonji as a dangerous cult and to bring back those lost sheep that had joined Shincheonji. How to do it? This included and includes, because it's still a present day situation, this includes the kidnapping and confinement of converts during days, weeks, and sometimes months, if needed, during which they are coercively submitted to a program of naming and shaming of Shincheonji with the logistical assistance of their network of so-called ethical counseling centers run by fundamentalist pastors and evangelists. This practice, known as deprogramming, has been studied for decades by scholars in religious studies in Europe and in America, where it was implemented last century until it was made illegal. There are changes of religion under coercion in such circumstances in South Korea is a serious violation of human rights according to international standards. Although it is totally illegal and criminalized, the authorities usually turn a blind eye to this practice, and finally it is impunity that prevails. There are no solid statistics about the extent of the phenomenon, but from January to September of last year, Shincheonji registered 166 cases of failed coercive deconversion attempts and over 1,500 from 2003 to 2020. The number of successful, if I can use that word, coercive deconversion cases remains, of course, unknown. However, such partial statistics shed some light on an illegal practice that has enjoyed impunity in South Korea, and this is not admissible. In 2019, I have met and interviewed in Seoul a number of Shincheonji members who were victims of deprogramming and attempts of coercive change of religion in confinement conditions and after kidnapping. Last year, we published a report about this phenomenon entitled Coercive Change of Religion in South Korea, with lots of concrete and well-documented testimonies. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the fundamentalist Protestant churches have seen a unique opportunity to destroy Shincheonji, decapitating it and ruining it, which had always been their objective. The COVID-19 pandemic provided them with a dream occasion to again sow hostility against it, capitalized on other vested interests, and come nearer to the final solution of their problem when a so-called super spreader and a cluster were discovered in one of its churches. Through their privileged relations with the media, state authorities, political parties, and the media, they have launched a new crusade against Shincheonji, asking for its ban and the imprisonment of its 89-year-old leader, Chairman Lee. At that time, South Korea was on the eve of parliamentary elections due to take place in April 2020. The Protestant fundamentalists saw here a new opportunity to get rid of Shincheonji. They collected signatures to ask the political authorities for the dissolution of Shincheonji. What is surprising is that politicians at various levels, from city authorities to cabinet ministers, also supported proposals to deregister Shincheonji and making it illegal as a religion, to raid its churches and to file criminal lawsuits against its leaders, including Chairman Lee. Scapegoating an already unpopular group was seen as a convenient way for some politicians to distract attention from their own mistakes in handling the virus crisis. Fundamentalists are a sizable block of voters. And as mentioned earlier, they succeeded in creating a diffuse hostility against the movement. Candidly, the Korean Minister of Justice admitted that there was no legal precedent for measures against Shincheonji, but she would consider adopting them because polls showed that they were supported by 86% of South Korean citizens. Very strange, acting against a minority based on polls. That's really strange in a democratic country like South Korea. But the incident illustrates the level of anti-Shincheonji moral panic artificially created in the country, artificially created by its opponents. In conclusion, the arrest of an 89-year-old respected religious leader on obviously trumped charges was a travesty of justice, an attempt to destroy a religious movement and a serious breach of religious liberty. Neither political parties, nor media, or civil society associations, or judicial institutions should ever intervene in an inter-religious conflict on theological issues. Now, due to the crusade and the lobbying of the fundamentalist Protestant churches, Shincheonji places of worship are still closed. Their members are deprived of their right to exercise their religious freedom. And because the names of a number of them have been leaked to the media by the state tracking system, a number of them have lost their job or a promotion or have been in conflict with their own families. South Korea needs to be taken accountable before the international human rights institutions and for tolerating the illegal practice of coercive change of religion as practiced in the aforementioned circumstances by fundamentalist Protestant pastors, and also for detaining a very old man on spurious charges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Willy. Very interesting presentation. Now we have Rosita Sorite. Rosita Sorite will ponder on the verdict within the broader context, also international, on how minority groups were scapegoated by the media, COVID-19 and beyond. Rosita, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro. So it's very difficult to be original in presentations because all the angles already were covered. So it's just like, if we would remember, is that everybody in the Western world, by the Western media, all of us, we were informed that some very evil cult, and I'm recalling the information of February 2020. All of us, we were informed that there is some evil cult called Shincheonji, and spreading, almost willingly spreading the virus in South Korea. And that it was through almost all the very reputable media outlets around the world. It's BBC, it's in France, it's in US, it was in all possible media. So when all of us, we informed about how things are happening and what the crime is committed. And once already the decision, the verdict is taken by the Korean, South Korean legal system, which is, in a way, it's good that it was, that Shincheonji was cleared of all the accusations against spreading intentionally the virus. But surprisingly, the Western media never mentioned that. And if even the case that the members of Shincheonji, they were massively giving the blood transfusion just to give for the scientists the opportunity to analyze the blood and reactions after the people being sick and etc. So none of the media in the Western world informed us about that. And me personally, I saw in summer one reportage from South Korea about how South Korea is dealing with the COVID inside. The reportage was on France 24. And I very intentionally, I was waiting that they would at least once, when they show the people giving the blood, at least once to say that these people are the members of the group of Shincheonji, which before we heard that it's an evil cult. And that, I believe, is the most unfortunate thing, that is not only as Willy Fautré was defining the vested interested groups, and he gave all the information on how these groups are working, how the one of the movements is devilized and scapegoated and persecuted. It should, in our minds in Western Europe, it should look that it should be something that first it's really to see, to criticize and not accept it. But at the same time, what I see in the Western media is kind of silent conspiracy, if I may say so. I don't want to go that far, but it sounds something that is not entirely okay. Because we talk very openly about the human rights, for instance. Many measures on how to fight the COVID in Europe in particular, it cannot be implemented because it's always in the breach of the human rights. But once it comes to the religious group, suddenly we become incapable of hearing and seeing what is really so badly in front of us. And the biggest problem, and that is from the human rights point of view, is so difficult to accept and think about the toll on people's life. Think about the 89 years old leader, Chairman Lee, who it's to be accused, to be publicized as the evil person of an evil cult through the media is still one thing, but to detain a person, because normally we detain a person when is the risk that person will, I don't know, somehow continue be dangerous for the society. And the reasonable question is like how the man of 80 years old can be dangerous for the society. To put him in custody, to keep him in custody, and finally he was cleared of the main and the first accusations about the COVID, but still he stayed in jail. And thinking that in the society of South Korea, what the people of certain age, they are the respectful people. That is this beautiful tradition of respecting the old people, to really venerate them, to help them. And suddenly we see the person in jail, and he is not dangerous for the society. And then if you take the damage that has been done for the entire movement, that is beyond our understanding, how these people who are the members, how they now can continue living. And then I'm thinking about every individual member whose names they were leaked, as Willy Fautré was mentioning. These names became public. So even before the members of Shincheonji trying to make it secret that they are members, just not to get really being attacked by the co-workers, in the families, friends, and etc. So it's now suddenly they were exposed and say, you are the member of Shincheonji, meaning you are somehow very bad. So, and the question is like, who can really now repay the damage that was done? For the human cost of this seems a simple problem, which became a human tragedy, in fact, because the rationality or the justification of the things that the government asked from the members, it was beyond any logical explanation of why should be done, and the consequences with which people they may live. And that is, it's an enormous and very heavy burden on people. And I'm wondering what may be the legal possibilities. And myself, seeing the context in South Korea, I don't see any, and that is very sad for me. Because if it would be the case in Europe, certainly the people, they can go to the human rights court and have the damage and at least acknowledgement of what has been done to them, and compensation, the financial compensation. But I don't see that that happening. The only possible instance, it may be the International United Nations Human Rights Council, but it will not be at the scale of the damage reparation. So I believe it's a very sad, but in a way loudly speaking case about how the COVID pandemic allowed for in many places to make the final battle against those who don't like. And that is, I believe, because there are certain positive aspects in this pandemic, but that one is one of the most painful, and in particular from the individual human perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosita. Thank you, everyone. We have now received quite a few questions from the audience. We have some time for discussion. So the way I would do now is to read the questions addressed to each panelist, and then we can have some sort of discussions if anyone of you wants to add something. The first question is addressed to John. John, the question is, why do you believe Shincheonji is more targeted than other new religions in Korea?
Thank you. That's a good question. First of all, I want to say I do qualitative and not quantitative research, so I haven't produced any methods or gone over numbers to necessarily say for certain that Shincheonji is more targeted for, I guess, for persecution or controversy or whatever, than any other religions. I don't even know how you can objectively measure that. But I don't know that it is all the time. I think it is right now because of the COVID pandemic and its popular association, as I discussed earlier. Once that first infection cluster was found to be linked to Shincheonji, all this media attention became focused on it. Now, it was controversial and targeted before, And I think it's earlier targeting, the reason it was sort of near the top of targeting by primarily mainstream Christianity, but also others in society, was that it was, it was becoming quite successful at competing with not only just getting members, but particularly at competing with mainstream Protestant churches who are very influential in society, politics, and culture in South Korea, in getting membership. And that sort of created, influential enemies. It's not the first group to be targeted this way. Other new religious movements have been targeted and persecuted against. And another factor, I think, is international reputation. Any media, any group that gets in, international and domestic, I'd say, anytime a group makes it into the media for some reason, are connected with politics, international affairs, if it's known to be proselytizing abroad, and people are aware that that's being connected back to Korea, and Shincheonji does spread beyond Korea's borders, and it goes to other countries. It's been coming up for years in media in other countries. India, for example, keeps reporting on this South Korean or Korean, religious sect or group, and then they speak about it in these negative ways, and that doesn't reflect well back on Korea. So then that creates the cycle of wanting to crack down on that, wanting to sort of disavow that connection with mainstream religion in Korea. You've seen other groups that have done this. I can't remember the name of it. There was one that was down in a Southeast Asian oceanic island that was quite controversial. In past years, two different religious groups came into the spotlight for political reasons during the Park Geun-hye administration. Guwon-pa was connected indirectly, but popularly in the media with the Sewol ferry sinking. And then Young Se-gyo was connected with Chae Soon-sil, the shaman advisor. So everyone sort of gets their spot, their 15 minutes of not so good fame. But I think ultimately it is a combination of international awareness that creates a self-consciousness, which is quite evident in the media whenever these groups get talked about. Numbers, competition with the mainstream religions, especially Christianity. If you're competing directly with Christian churches, the Protestant churches especially, that's going to make the group seen as a threat. And then really it was catapulted by connection with COVID.
Thank you, John. We have a second question, which is very well connected to the last remark made by Rosita in her presentation. This one is addressed to Burke, to Sharon Burke. The question is, you said that Shincheonji may have international recourses for defamation damages. Can you please elaborate on this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the question of defamation damages is quite an interesting one, and I suppose my comment stems from the fact, as has already been observed, that a lot of damaging things were written both about Shincheonji itself and about Chairman Lee and potentially other members in the international media. Now, I suspect a lot of this has come from Korean news outlets, and to be clear, defamation law, generally speaking, although let's say the limits of what's acceptable in international defamation law are guided to some extent by international human rights law, defamation pertains to domestic law. So it is something that is regulated by the national legislation of individual states rather than by international law per se. But in this regard, it's probably interesting to have a look at Korea's defamation law, because obviously most of the instances where damaging things might have been published, since there's of course more interest in this in Korea itself, would have been in Korean media outlets. And what's interesting about Korea's defamation law is that Korea maintains on its books in Article 307 to 312 of the Korean Penal Code, Korea maintains on its books a criminal defamation statute. which is quite unusual, and which tends to be opposed by human rights groups favoring the freedom of expression. So the Council of Europe organs in the past, for example, have said that criminal defamation laws on the books in European states contravene to a greater or lesser extent international human rights laws. But the problem with having a criminal defamation law system in Korea is that it means that a portion of the responsibility for ensuring that people are not defamed falls upon the state rather than upon other individuals. So, for example, if you're in, let's say, any Western state, let's say Britain, for example, and you're defamed by another individual, they say something nasty about you in public, or they write an article about you that defames you, then it's up to you to contract a lawyer and to sue that person for money, for damages, for compensation, for money. In this instance, by maintaining a criminal defamation statute, if you like, the first pressure to act in this circumstance falls upon the public prosecutor. So the public prosecutor in Korea is the institution that is expected to act. And given public attitudes, as have been discussed, towards Shincheonji, the possibility for the public prosecutor to act under this law is pretty limited. I mean, it's very unlikely that the prosecutor will use his or her discretion to act in favor, if you like, of Shincheonji and against press organizations. Now, Korea itself does maintain, enforce civil defamation laws as well, but these are also problematic for various reasons, not least because there is a huge amount of abuse that goes on in Korea of the civil defamation laws, particularly in relation to cyber defamation. So I'm not sure whether any of you are aware, but Korea in particular has a large online gaming community, and online gaming, there tends to be a lot of, if you like, banter, sort of informal exchanges, either spoken or typed, while people are gaming with each other. And sometimes this can be quite insulting. And whereas in certain countries, calling somebody something simple, for example, labeling them a homosexual or using bad language in a kind of an informal context, it's not actionable in defamation law. In Korea, it is. And as a result, you have a situation where gamers, some people engage in these online games and attempt to provoke other people into using negative language about them solely with the purpose of suing them. So you have a widespread problem in Korea of abuse of the defamation laws in a civil context, which means that the courts are jammed up with this sort of stuff, and they don't tend to take these cases as seriously as perhaps they should. So we have two pillars of defamation law within Korea, a civil pillar, which is very problematic because of the gaming community, and a criminal pillar, which is problematic because the first right of action pertains to the public prosecutor, and the public prosecutor is unlikely to act. So in the context of Korea itself, possibilities for Shincheonji, Chairman Lee, to take action in this regard are quite limited. However, it is to be noted that potentially defamatory things have been written about Shincheonji in other jurisdictions as well. And in those circumstances, it would be for Shincheonji, Chairman Lee, or anybody else who's implicated to take action in the national courts of that state against the publication in question. So against, if it's the New York Times, then in the courts of the state of New York, for example. And there, the defamation laws may be significantly more accommodating, given that they're based upon a fairly standard civil formula, that if you say something untrue or damaging against somebody in print publication, then that person may be entitled to compensation.
Thank you very much, Sharon. We have now a question for Massimo. The question is, one would believe that in South Korea there is freedom of expression and assembly. On what was based the opponent's request that Shincheonji events should be cancelled?
Yeah, that's a good question. There were two arguments. The first argument is particularly one group, which is called the National Association of the Victims of Shincheonji, That's an anti-cult group specialized in fighting Shincheonji. They wrote to the cities or other entities which had rented the stadiums, claims that it was dangerous to have these events for public order because they will be riots. And that, of course, is very paradoxical because the riots were organized by the same association. So, to use an example easy to understand, it would have been if the Proud Boys or some other American groups would have written to the American government to say, if you go on and confirm Biden as president on the 6th of January, there will be riots. So in the interest of not having riots, you should cancel the event in the Capitol. So the same people organizing the riot say the event should be canceled because if you go on with the event, there will be riots and problems for public order. And by the way, there were no riots because the events went on and only like 20, 30 people showed up to protest, which were easily handled by the police and kept at a distance from the premises. So it was basically a bluff. But the main legal argument, which was in a way serious, used to ask that these events be cancelled, is these events were organized in public or semi-public premises. And to rent in Korea a semi-public or public premise, you should abide by certain regulations. By the way, there are similar regulations in other countries too. And normally, the regulations say that public facilities are not rented for religious missionary activities based on the principle of separation of church and state. So the National Association of the Victims of Shincheonji wrote to the landlords, which happen to be public bodies, saying, beware, because you have signed a rental agreement with HWPL or another volunteer association that no longer exists. And what will really happen in these events will be missionary proselyting activities on behalf of Shincheonji. So you are being taken for a ride because these people signed a contract pretending it's a cultural or political or peace event, but it's really a proselyting event on behalf of Shincheonji. And that's, by the way, is how these cases were settled. Because what happened is Shincheonji's lawyers, or HWPL's lawyers, to be more correct, wrote to the landlords saying, we will go on and we'll take the responsibility of doing the event, ignoring your illegal cancellation of the contract. But what we are doing is inviting you to the events. Please come, and you will see that there is no proselytization on behalf of Shincheonji. Of course, Chairman Lee, who is also the chairman or chairperson of HWPL, will be part of the event. But there will be no talk about Shincheonji, no propaganda about Shincheonji theology, and nobody will be asked to convert from her religion to Shincheonji. And normally the authorities in their position of landlords attended the events and heard from people like the former president of Romania or the former president of Serbia talking about war, peace, United Nations, and similar subjects, perhaps a little bit boring, but they didn't sue because they were bored, and they realized there was no proselytization for Shincheonji. So the National Association of Victims of Shincheonji had supplied to them false information. Now, the Suwon District Court, quite curiously, accepted these arguments as valid in 4 cases out of 5. And my criticism of the decision is that the 5th event was no different from the others. It was an event about peace, peace education, international law, no proselytization about Shincheonji either. And the court found some formal differences in the way the agreements were cancelled, but the long and the short of the matter is that the National Association of the Victims of Shincheonji had no valid legal reason to say that public administration was prevented by any Korean law from renting premises for these events.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Now the next question is addressed to Willy Fautrey. Should forced conversions and deprogramming not be punished by Korean courts? And why is this not happening?
Yeah, that's a very good and interesting question, especially for us in the Western world, I would say, because we are not used at all to such a phenomenon and to such a large extent. I would say that this phenomenon, this practice is forbidden by the criminal code and should be prosecuted, but it's not prosecuted. And that's the gap that is difficult for outsiders to understand, because we consider that any individual, being a major, should be an adult, should be allowed to choose the religion that he wants, or the churches that he wants. In South Korea, and not only in South Korea, but also in Japan and other countries in the region, the main reason is cultural, but not only cultural. I will expand a little bit about the cultural aspect. Is that in such societies, it is expected then that children are to obey their parents, whatever their age, whatever their level of education, and should remain in the family tradition on a number of issues. And that's that's the first reason that we have noticed in Japan, where we have interviewed quite a number of victims of people who converted to the Unification Church created by Reverend Moon, where over several decades, thousands of people had been, as in South Korea, kidnapped, detained by their own families, with the complicity again of some fundamentalist Protestant churches, and sometimes being incarcerated in that way, not only for weeks and months, but sometimes for years, the record being 12 years in the case of Torugoto. So there is that patriarchal, I would say, culture that is permeating the societies of those countries. The second reason is different, is that it is considered, as in our countries, in fact, that joining a cult, as soon as the word is used by the opponents, it creates an automatic reaction that they are dangerous, those cults. They are really harmful, they are secretive, strange, shadowy, they are going to use and misuse, instrumentalize your people, whether it is your children, who of course are in all the cases adults, but also it might be a wife or a husband. So that sort of stereotype, in fact, has been spread around by the anti-cult organizations, relayed by the media, and believed by everybody, as it has been explained by other speakers before me. And so that's the second reason, that parents are afraid. And I would say it's legitimate for parents to be afraid about the future of your children, even if they are adults. But as I said, it's not only in those countries in Far East Asia, but also in our countries in Europe. When someone joins the Church of Scientology, for example, wow, there is a absolutely consensus in the media, in the society, that those people are in danger and that they are going to be manipulated, that the church will, the Scientology church will steal their money, their property, and so on and so on. And then in the mindset of those people, whether in the West or in East Asia, it is justified to use any means to save the member of your family that has been a prey of such a cult. And it's also in the mindset of not only the media, and the media influence the politicians and influences the judiciary. And so there is that an invisible agreement, consensus, that those people must be safe and from those evil cults. So I will not go into more details, but I would say it's not specific to East Asian societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willie. We have one more question, which is addressed to Rosita. You wrote a book about Scientology and the COVID-19, where you said that good activities by Scientology volunteers were ignored by most media, and Scientology was falsely accused of not respecting COVID regulations. Would you say that the same prejudices against Scientology in the US or Europe operate against Shincheonji in South Korea and beyond, and perhaps other groups too?
My perception is that what is happening in Shincheonji in South Korea is slightly worse than the worst, perhaps one of the worst case scenario is Scientology in the Western world, in US and Europe, but still is not at the same level as people belonging to the Shincheonji group are persecuted in South Korea. So even what we know about the Scientology, even that is stronger, and that is very worrisome. So, and I didn't really, because during the COVID, in fact, all of us are in the hands of media, because we cannot go and talk to people ourselves. We cannot really travel around and have really independent and unbiased information. So, and I believe after the lockdowns, once we will be able to get real contacts and direct contacts with people, we can really assess what happened in the COVID. Is because it's not only enough that people would say, like, people belonging to the religious groups, they will say what they say, what they do. It's like we should like also believe like 100%. We should judge on our own, and now is our ability to judge is very difficult. And what we see in media, the fact is we almost don't see anything. So it's so then we live in the world that we don't know exactly. We cannot pass the judgment. But the cases of Scientology, the cases of other groups, we know it's the case of Shincheonji. It's clear that the COVID situation just allowed, in a sense, open the hands for the government and society to do what it was already boiling before. So neither the Scientology, nor the Shincheonji, not the Luz del Mundo in Mexico, none of these groups, the problems, it didn't appear with the COVID, and certainly they didn't disappear with COVID. Is normally it's like in a certain situations, and in particular Shincheonji is a very specific, very like so blatant case of that for some groups it's an opportunity to finalize the destruction of the movement, and COVID was a perfect excuse because it's like to do so you need this public outcry, and when the thing like COVID comes and everybody personally is afraid, so meaning every single person personally is emotionally reactive, so it's a perfect ground to build something and have the public approval for the things, and that's exactly what happened in South Korea. And that everybody personally, but what I was telling, and I will repeat myself, is like when people they were, how to say, their names became public, they became known, the members of families, they learned that suddenly the member of your family is the member of Shincheonji. So it was even the case that somebody was thrown out, the lady was thrown out of the window by the husband because she is Shincheonji, meaning she's evil person, first of all. And the second of all is absolutely she will be sick of COVID. So it's like these things, but they didn't appear with the COVID, and they will not disappear with the COVID. Is something that we just have this opportunity of the public emotional involvement finally to deal with something that we hated before. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosita. Now I have a question by myself. It's about the future. Can we expect any improvement in the wider South Korean society following the verdict on the Shincheonji case? Many points have been raised today, many issues. We spoke about fake news, defamatory campaigns, and scapegoating, and really focused on the very disgraceful kidnapping and deprogramming in South Korea. Can anything change? Can things improve in South Korea as things very slightly changed also in the Western world? Not everything is okay in Europe, but things are slightly changing. So can we expect anything like this in South Korea? This is open question to anyone. Go, Massimo.
Yeah, I add a comment because I have had many exchanges with Korean academics about the Shincheonji case. And I would say that there have been two reactions by colleagues. One very bad and one very good. The bad reaction mostly comes from professors in Christian and alas, not only Protestant fundamentalist, but even Catholic universities. Their reaction is to multiply inquiries which can be summarized in this question. All of you have written about Shincheonji without attacking Shincheonji. How much have you been paid by Shincheonji? Because they cannot believe that the scholars who write about such an evil group as Shincheonji in independent terms without being hired gun. And of course, my answer has always been, you are very late because these accusations have been going on for decades in the West about everybody writing about Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons or the Church of Scientology, but even about the Catholic Church. If you write a book on pedophile priests without accepting everything some lawyers will say or raising some doubts, of course, the question again is how much you have been paid by the Vatican. So this is, I believe, it's the most interesting part of this reaction, that it's totally forbidden in Christian circles in Korea to talk about Shincheonji, if not for saying it's an evil ship-stealing hereticals. And that includes, unfortunately, Christian universities. But then there has been another reaction that, quite surprisingly, we have seen some good articles by Korean academics, perhaps not affiliated with any Christian groups, about the scapegoating of Shincheonji, about the problems with the law on epidemic prevention. Professor Burke was mentioning before. So we saw some good articles, and occasionally even in some quality Korean media, there were what I would call normal articles on the Shincheonji case. So there is some small change in Korean society, and in terms of the law on preventing epidemics and an easy accusation of sabotaging epidemic prevention by religious groups, perhaps we will see some improvement. And I understand we are concluding our event, but on a broader scale, and I go back to the question somebody asked to Rosita before. I believe on a broader scale, when the dust settles, it will be very difficult to ignore the good deeds of new religious movements during the COVID. Groups like Scientology or La Luz del Mundo, notwithstanding all the accusation of sexual abuse against its leaders, but these are groups many people found in the street, helping, distributing free meals to the poorest section of the population, distributing free masks, free disinfectants when they were needed. And that affected tens of thousands, perhaps in the world, millions of persons. So I believe in the end, and the case of La Luz del Mundo, I believe it's very interesting because I talk with people who met volunteers of La Luz del Mundo in the poorest segments of Los Angeles, giving free meals. And then some Christian pastor say, don't you know that their leader is accused of sexual abuse? And the answer, not in such a kind terms as I refer it, say, couldn't care less. I'm in need and these people are here for me. And you are not here for me, but these people are. So these are good people, and then we will see about the leader. And I believe also that's true in Korea in a way for the plasma donations of thousands of Shincheonji. members. So these good deeds, when the dust settles in some way, will remain, even as we heard from Willy and Rosita and Professor Burke, the media slander and the pressure is also, of course, very high.
Thank you, Massimo. Are there any other comments? We have 3 minutes left.
Okay.
I see Willy is ready. Go, Willy, please.
Thank you. Just a few points. I will try to be brief. Human rights NGOs have been and are very reluctant in dealing with cases such as the ones that we have exposed, because they are not familiar with those issues, and it's difficult to involve them in the battle, legal or other sorts of battles through the media to defend movements, religious movements or belief movements and their members in the public scene. That's the first point. They also don't want to be involved in being perceived as taking sides with this theological this theology or that theology inside the same religious family like Christianity or others. Although we have seen some progress. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, were never defended for years and years in the 1990s, I remember, and also the first decade of this century. They were never defended by human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, except when they were conscientious objectors to military service. Now you have more and more human rights institutions that defend that movement and their members. Also the fact that Human Rights Watch, for example, does not shy away from defending the Ahmadis, although they are also perceived as a cult in Pakistan, for example, but also in Algeria and other countries. So there is some progress. It is slow, but at least it exists. The positive point, I would say, is that on the issue of kidnapping and deprogramming in confinement conditions in Japan, we managed to solve the problem, because now there are no such cases anymore. And it was because we took the cases during several years to the level of the United Nations. So that's certainly one avenue that could be explored but in South Korea. Also, I think it would be useful to approach international Protestant umbrella organizations. I think the World Evangelical Associations, and pointing at a problem that is posed by Protestant evangelical movements in South Korea. Maybe they could, let's say, change their opinions, discipline them a little bit. And a last news that I got this morning, and I want to share with you, I got an email from a member of the parliament in France saying, well, I don't react very often to what you publish, but really I fully support what you and Chesnur are publishing about the law, so-called law on separatism in France, and I really share your views. So it means that we must go on publishing, go on informing the universities and researchers worldwide, so our message, and we see that at the end, truth will prevail and justice will prevail. That's my personal opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willy, for your final remark. Time is over, so I believe we can now conclude the seminar. So thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to the IT team that made this
Yes.
event possible today.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to add anything? If not, we can go, and have a lovely day, everyone.